Okay, so today we've got a little bit of housekeeping. I want to open it up for Q&A, and then we'll get to discuss these readings. And just sort of fast forwarding to that, it looked like the reading that excited most of you, or excited is maybe the wrong word, but the reading that was most provocative to all of you guys was the environmental racism one. So I think we should probably start with that. In terms of housekeeping, I've updated the syllabus. I think it's going to help us with our schedule. Um, can I should be able to. Thought I could share files, but I can't. It's up on Canvas, so it shouldn't be a problem. Um, but make sure you download the new syllabus. That's what we'll be working from. There's not a lot of substantive changes. It's just to sort of streamline when we're talking about discussion articles versus when we're doing textbook chapters. The other bit of housekeeping is make sure you're using that discussion board. So days like today, where we're talking about specific readings, can really be more dynamic, and we have a lot more to talk about. So before we dive into the discussions, does anyone have any questions that they want answered? Okay, so like I said, it seemed like what was most provocative to all of you was this discussion of environmental racism. And so let's start by just opening it up to the floor. What are some of the ways that you all think that race and perhaps poverty interact with the environment? And in particular, we can talk about exposure to pollution, but we can talk about things that are more broad beyond that. So what do you guys think? And for this purpose, let's keep it as a US based discussion, but if you want to bring in other countries, that's fine.
Something I talked about and put in my discussion board was how consumerism, and I want to steer away from saying capitalism, so hierarchical and patriarchal systems of structure can often encourage or enforce the exploitation of labor and resources, which directly relate to racism, sexism, and a lot of the ecological destruction and degradation that we see of the land and the environment. More specifically, I think of in the US, and this is more of a global terms, but sometimes I look at the pandemic and look at how there is a theory and there is a TED Talk that talks about how a lot of the decisions and behaviors we make about what we consume ends up being that we move into these spaces around the world, and we push into like rainforests, and we push into these new spaces that we're not prepared to deal with the ecosystems that exist. And as a result, these animal diseases and viruses jump over to humans. And so how a lot of the decisions we make exploit certain areas. And because of taking down the rainforest, we see tourism go down. We see that it takes away power from the local communities and populations, and so it goes back to like social ecology and stuff.
Absolutely. So let's unpack that out a little bit, because you said a lot of different things there. All of it was great. Thank you for getting the discussion rolling. So first off, I think it's really cool that you said let's avoid using a term like capitalism, right? Because to an economist, that's a pretty imprecise term. Is Denmark capitalist? Is Norway? And are they more or less capitalist than a country like Nicaragua or a country like the U.S.? So I think you're right to, instead of some economic system labeling, to instead focus on what you did, both in terms of power hierarchies and power dynamics. So let's start off by just focusing on that. How do you all, Bijou already did a great job getting the ball rolling. How do you all think that these power dynamics play into something saying like how race and poverty affect pollution exposure? Anyone want to add something?
I think it just continues on to the topic of people who are already in poverty continue to experience more bad things. So it's just another thing that they have to worry about in life. Whereas like for the people who are above the poverty line, they necessarily don't always have to worry about that. And I think a good example would be like the Flint water crisis.
Mhm.
That's an area that had very high numbers of poverty.
Right. Anyone else have anything they want to add? And just to go back to what I was saying a second ago, I'm dropping a link to the new syllabus in the chat. So Bijou, you mentioned you specifically in your answer the post that you added to the discussion page. So do you mind if I read it out loud for the class?
No, I don't mind.
Okay. So after reading about the environmental racism, or you didn't say, I have several questions and thoughts. The first is whether our environmental issues are a manifestation of our anthropocentric mindset and our relationship to self and others. Bijou goes on to wonder if by tackling issues of racism, classism, genderism, we can mitigate some of the environmental damage that we've seen. She asks if cost of living and GDP are related to environmental degradation, which goes, further links to what we were talking about last week with pollution, and asks whether poverty is in part an effect of ecological destruction. So right away, we have several questions that come out of that. So Annika, you mentioned that poverty seems to be sort of self-fulfilling and self-reinforcing. You talked about poverty traps and how it's hard to escape poverty. Bijou, you talk about poverty perhaps as a cause and effect of environmental degradation. I'm paraphrasing and distorting your words slightly, so all apologies in advance, but please know it's done for the sake of discussion. So what do you guys think? Anyone have anything they want to add to that? Mi-song or Grace?
Not really.
Okay. Grace, Katie, anything you want to add?
I'm good.
All right. So from there, maybe this is a discussion-based class. So maybe from there we can move on to Tiffany's question, who's not here, which is this is clearly problematic that we have, first of all, people that are experiencing deleterious and negative outcomes, both as a result of the economy and in particular as a result of the environmental economy. So what solutions can we posit? Or are we doomed to repeat such problematic cycles forever?
I have a question more specifically. I
Yes.
asked about GDP because I remember last year in principles of, I don't know if it was micro or macro, we looked at how light pollution, or like when we looked at a map and we saw how much light was in a certain continent or country, it reflected productivity of that location and therefore supported a lot of the GDP assumptions. And that was a model utilized to be able to determine the state of a country. Is it that the models that are being utilized on an economic standpoint to address things like productivity are not as efficient anymore as a result of how fast the environmental degradation is advancing? Or is it that we have yet to discover a model that is a great indicator of a country's well-being and still factoring the ecological destruction?
So next week we're going to be talking about some constructs like green GDP and whether they're more effective or perhaps more perhaps better at identifying some of the concerns you raise. But let me flip that question back at you, because all GDP is an accounting system. And the reason we use this accounting system is because it's quite good at what it does, which is account. But what it might not account for, to the point you raised, is things like income inequality, things like environmental degradation. So what, and like I said, we're going to talk about green GDP next week, but what might we do to better account for some of these issues that we're concerned with, both as citizens and scholars generally, but as environmental economists particularly?
In these heavier, like polluted areas that more people below the poverty line live in, they don't usually have jobs at that plant. So maybe turning that into a job opportunity for them. Like since they live in that area, they should also have the opportunity to work in that area. Therefore, then showing them what they're being exposed to in their environment, then which could start them to, I guess, change how that company works in the end.
So it sounds like you're talking sort of about like cooperative models and citizen ownership.
Yeah.
And you know, with our discussion this past week of externalities, one of the things we might think that citizen ownership does is help to internalize the externality, right? It's no longer, you know, you polluting in someone else's backyard if it's your own backyard. What do the rest of you think? What are, you know, to Annika's point and Bijou's question, what are some other ways that we can, as citizens, as scholars, as environmental economists, account for the fact that we have, let's say, an unfair system? Or maybe to raise a different question, you know, we've talked a lot about, both in this class and other economics classes, about markets, but it's not our job as economists, nice cat, it's not our job as economists to advocate for the market, it's our job to study the market. So what's so great about markets anyway? You know, what does it mean to be efficient? What does it mean to maximize social welfare? What do you guys think? Is efficiency an end worth seeking?
I think we've talked a lot about regulation, and something we have not isolated is the consumer and the citizen and where those interests conflict and align. And is it that we need more regulation to be able to account for a lot of the environmental degradation that we have on a more individual level, rather than it being as a country effort? Like there's things like the Paris Accord, and like we're going to reduce emissions by this amount by this certain year, and it be so abstract that it almost feels so far from individuals. And I think that may be a place to start to begin to tackle that issue, is to isolate a lot of the pollution and a lot of the issues to individual contributions rather than just full countries and measuring systems.
Excellent point. So can we sort of compare and contrast two of the things you said, which is we need to account for power structures when we're considering solutions. But arguably, Amazon or you know, Sweetbriar or whoever has more power as an institution than we have as an individual. So how do you reconcile those two? And that's not just to Bijou, that's to everyone. Because these are, you know, excellent points, but there's definitely an inherent tension between the two of them. Or to ask maybe a similar but slightly different question, earlier in class we talked about, you know, the importance of maintaining liberty, maintaining choice, but like you said, with things like regulation, that's going to restrict our choices. So how do we account for that? Christina, what do you think?
How we account for restricted choice. I don't know. I would just make data points that blatantly state that the situation was limited, and then compare that to situations that aren't limited. I don't really understand the question. I'm sorry.
That's fine. And if anyone wants, you know, a different discussion question or to phrase a discussion question differently, you know, this is a discussion that we are building together as a class. So I'm happy to alter it in the directions that you want. But what I was saying was, you know, how, first of all, just how do we make the situation better? And we can talk about lots of different, we can talk about pollution, we can talk specifically about the fact that, we're concerned with externalities like pollution have disparate impact on otherwise historically disadvantaged social groups. One of the solutions that we posited was regulation, but to what extent does regulation infringe on individual liberty? And is that something we care about?
Oh, go ahead.
No, please.
I was going to say, so I would say regulation can infringe on personal rights just because, at least with how the United States is set up, there's just so many, I guess even now more or less the world, that there's so much mingling of different cultures and ideas. So I would say it's just no regulation is going to satisfy everyone. And I guess it would infringe on your rights, just because those making the rights may not even consider or even know of the struggle that you may be having because they're on a different playing field.
Great. Anyone else? Oh, sorry, I didn't mean to cut you off.
To kind of piggyback off of that idea, the idea of just whether you live in an area that's more polluted than others, there's also the concept of like living a more sustainable, lower waste life, and being below the poverty line, you're going to choose items that are cheaper and less sustainable. So like, buying like a toothbrush, you can get a plastic toothbrush for 99 cents, but if you're willing to spend more money, you can get a bamboo one. Or the same with like pasta, stuff like that, getting it in styrofoam instead of cardboard that can be recycled. So just all goes back to no matter what, the playing field will not ever be even for the people who live below the poverty line, I feel like.
Yeah, excellent point. So can we roll with that for a little bit? And, when we're comparing, say, institutional regulation versus individual regulation, is it fair to expect people that might be otherwise disadvantaged to make the same, let's say, sacrifices, but we can phrase it differently in terms of something like sustainability?
I was going to say that I know like in countries like Japan, they're able to more so regulate the sustainability that each person is able to do, and the amount of waste that they are producing as a family unit. But in contrast to that, like countries like Vietnam were not able to regulate people's sustainability and the products that they are able to get their hands on. So it really does show like the poverty level will severely impact the ability for one to be like sustainable.
Great. So with that in mind, let's something Christina said really struck me, which is no regulation is going to be perfect for everyone. So let's, bring this back to the econ question at hand. What does it mean to maximize social surplus?
But in this situation, what would be the surplus?
So, in econ, we're concerned with welfare. We consider welfare the sum of consumer surplus and producer surplus. Just textbook definitions. Those are the benefits that consumers and producers get from participating in the market.
I think that it's a balance of both. Like we always usually think about regulatory approach versus an individualized approach.
Mm-hmm.
And that's why I keep going back to GDP in the sense that like it's an indicator that we utilize to measure an economy's health. And we don't have the same indicator to measure an environmental, like the health of the environment for a certain location. And so I think there is the per capita, so it's the per individual, but there also is the factoring of businesses and industries. So there is the ability to make such a system. But my thing is, how do we approach something like an environmental issue on an economic standpoint when something like we talked about poverty and how it's not equal for everyone, but many people think the solution to poverty is a universal income. And that is still a way to try and create some level of equity, utilizing a system such as a GDP or how much an individual makes to be able to then say, okay, this is a standard we can set for everyone. So my thing is, what could we measure the environment in an economical way? Or is that not feasible, and that there needs to be another indicator that we can measure that would therefore also account for like the environment?
So I'm having some trouble following your question, because are you, we do measure the environment, right? I can tell you the air quality today. I can tell you, to a reasonable approximation, how much carbon is in the atmosphere, how much particulate matter is in the atmosphere, whether, we're on a coal grid or a solar grid. So I feel like, and perhaps this is just my misunderstanding, but I feel like I'm missing sort of a middle piece of what you're saying. Does that make sense?
And I
So,
think that is this, what I'm trying to say is that there isn't that middle piece. Is like, we know we are able to measure someone's poverty level, and therefore can be able to say that something like a universal basic income is something that could cushion that, or like mitigate a lot of the poverty that we see. But when it comes to environmental issues, and we try to look at it, we have the numbers and the statistics, and we're able to say whether or not it's good or bad. But from an economic standpoint, it's hard to see that there is a solution that already exists that we could say this would work universally, and
okay,
not even for individuals, but for entire countries and stuff.
so let's tie the two things you were saying together then, and then you as a class, so all of you, can tell me whether you think this is morally right, ethically right, economically right. But we talked about this a little last week. Is it wrong to be able to buy and sell pollution? And let's tie that into Bijou's point, right? We can come up with any number of indicators of economic health, or I should say, sorry, environmental health. What if, in addition to income supplements like the earned income tax credit, like forms of universal basic income, what if we also had environmental supplements where you got paid some amount of money if you were in a situation of poor environmental health? So we know that pollution disproportionately affects poor neighborhoods. That's sort of what started this discussion. Is paying people to compensate for that good or bad?
I feel like if I'm understanding the question right, it would be bad because then you're encouraging people to pollute.
Okay, I mean, perhaps tell me more. Where are the incentives misaligned there?
Because if, say, in like the healthcare example, you compensated for if you have a health issue related to an environmental problem. You could have another underlying problem already, but then you could just cover it up by saying this is an environmental problem as well, therefore getting like not free healthcare, but healthcare at a discounted price because it's believed to be environmentally caused.
Okay, so what if the it sounds like you're talking about a case of misaligned incentives. So what if we stipulated that it was polluter pays? Does that correct the misalignment?
I feel like yes. Then if it was a company based, that say like a company was polluting the water that people drink, they should have to pay for any issues that person who drank the water experiences from that.
Anyone else? What do you guys think?
Maybe the way we're looking at it is probably wrong.
Okay.
What if, when we think of, you're letting people choose to pay for something as if it's optional or doesn't have a consequence, and because we've never actually set a consequence per se, and I don't think consequence is the right word, we've created a system where there is no real result or answer to it. Like you wouldn't give a company the choice to pay a lot of its employees below minimum wage when you know that by setting a standard for that number, you're ensuring that many people do not fall below the poverty line. But with pollution, we're then giving people the businesses and companies the choice to pollute without that like negative consequence of if we move below this number, then there is a negative result that everyone experiences.
So I'm not exactly sure I follow you, but certainly all companies have the choice to pay people more.
But many
Right.
can go below that minimum, like there's a bracket in which you can't pay someone below a certain amount legally.
Right.
But for pollution, we've never set a strict code per se. And therefore that's why we're able to like negotiate as to how much or how little or how far and how like someone can go.
So given that, if we can negotiate, is that not a good thing? Is that, and or put differently, to what extent do we want a marketplace here? Because, one possible solution is some command and control, some, to use Christina's term, regulation, where some governmental entity says, you're not allowed to pollute this much, you're not allowed to pay people below this amount, you're not. Is that what we want? Or do we want a case where people can negotiate and bargain and come to a marketplace over it?
Wait, so livelihood is a marketplace? Wait, so you can like say whether someone is a life or death situation. That's a marketplace?
Well, I don't know where we got to life and death from, but
Well, like healthcare or like someone making a living or pollution, which has its health issues, can be something that we can negotiate on a marketplace standpoint, or is that more of like?
Well, certainly, but also wasn't that your position?
No.
Okay, so would you mind rephrasing your position for the group then?
That I think
Or
these are non-negotiable like aspects of like these are the wicked issues or problems that exist and result in these negative externalities, or it can result in death, that should be more regulated and not used as an opportunity to provide an incentive or a monetary incentive.
I agree with Bijou that it shouldn't be something where you can negotiate. They should be regulated.
okay, so Nissan, tell me what that looks like. What would this regulation, you're a political science major. Paint me a regulatory picture. And it doesn't have to be, grounded in research or reality, but if the benevolent central planner wanted to fix environmental racism, what would you do? Certainly that's a big question. I'm not trying to put it all on your shoulders, but what's a starting
I
point?
mean, theoretically, you could plan it out like the EU is planned out, where it's a coalition of different countries, and they have a unified committee of board members from each country who come together and will decide and argue for what is an acceptable amount, and all the countries in the coalition have to follow the decision.
So a minute ago, it sounded like you guys were opposed to negotiation, but coming together and deciding, is that not negotiating over pollution? And then more broadly, is that not negotiation taking place in a market? In this case, a marketplace of ideas, but also there are businesses represented saying, we need to do such and such, and there are environmentalists represented saying you need to dial it back such and such.
Well, what I was saying is more so regulated in the sense that there is a set amount that everyone is able to pollute, and you can't go past that without having certain consequences in place to be more of an incentive to stay within the bounds.
Yeah, I think that sounds like a great idea. My question to all of you is, how is that different from a marketplace?
Can we define what we mean in this context of marketplace?
Sure, and I'll stick with the textbook definition, which is a group of buyers and sellers coming together to negotiate over goods and services. But if we'll Bijou, if you don't mind, we'll stick with your example of minimum wage. Labor is still, negotiated upon in the market, and certainly we have situations where people might be earning below minimum wage. We can think about, like, when I pay my cat sitter $5 a day to come to the house, that's less than a minimum wage. It's not through any formal labor market. And one of the things that setting a price floor does is, create black market opportunities where people might want to undercut that minimum wage. Annika, does that answer your question about what a marketplace is in this context?
Yes. So the question as a whole then would be that it should be regulated more so for the consumers as well, no matter what the pollution is coming from.
Great. Anyone have anything they want to add to that? So I think that's a great opportunity for us to switch to another question that's asked in the discussion board, and certainly we can come back to environmental racism either later today or later in the semester. But Annika asks whether and correct me if I'm misrepresenting your question, but whether there's economic activity that doesn't lead to environmental problems, and whether there is environmental problems that doesn't lead to economic problems. So Annika asked about the interconnectedness of it. So Annika, why don't you take a second and sort of rephrase your question for the group, since I think I did a bad job of paraphrasing, and then we'll come back to that as a class.
I just looked at it, especially with the one article about the shrimp and fishing with that, is that no matter what happens on either side, whether you're the consumer or like the fisherman, you're going to have an economic problem, because the environmental problem is that we've shrimped so much that there are not the population has decreased on a severe level, but then for the consumer that's no good because there's not enough shrimp and shrimp prices are increasing, whereas for the fishermen it's good and bad in both ways, that they don't have as many shrimp possibly coming onto the boat, but even though prices have increased, they're not going to have those numbers to sell the same amount that they used to. So it just continued to like go back and forth, and the concept of like, if we looked into environmental threats more, would the economy not fluctuate as much? So if shrimp populations never have gone down, would we have ever had a economic issue within the shrimp?
Excellent point. I'll leave that to you all as a class to start to discuss, but let me just add that ties in to what we were saying earlier about these concepts of surplus, right? So to what extent are we benefiting from a marketplace that has shrimp regardless of price, and to what extent are shrimpers benefiting from being able to ride their boat into the Gulf and then sell their shrimp in the marketplace? So let's do someone we haven't heard from in a while. Katie or Grace, what do you guys think?
Can you paraphrase the question? I'm a little lost.
So Annika, you can correct me if I'm mis quoting you or misparaphrasing your question, but I think it's if we as a society took environmental threats more seriously, could we prevent economic fluctuations? And then would that be a good thing?
Yes, I think that if we took these issues more seriously, it would prevent fluctuation. But in some ways, I kind of feel that this is almost inevitable and inevitable for the economy. And I think that in some ways it also helps economic flow, and that in Annika's example, shrimping, we are shrimping too much, and shrimping is bad, and shrimp in the ocean are at a deficit. But the fact that the fishermen can make more money because shrimp are selling at a higher cost is a good thing for them. So if it's, to me, it's almost a question of, what we think of as rare and delicacy because of a result of not taking an environmental issue seriously. Now the shrimp are becoming more and more expensive. Is it going to keep going that way? I think morally and ethically it's bad, but for the shrimpers' economic growth, it might be a good thing.
So with an eye towards that, individual incentive, right? If the price of shrimp is quite high, you are incentivized to get a shrimp boat and go out there in the Gulf. To what extent is the onus of environmental protection on us, the consumer, the people eating shrimp? To what extent is it on the producer, the people shrimping? And to what extent is it on some third party like the government or perhaps some large distributor? Grace, what do you think?
I feel as though they're always going to be intertwined, like economic fluctuation with environmental issues, because yes, I completely agree with what Katie said. Like, people need to take these issues like more seriously, but I also feel like people need to understand that individuals base their livelihoods off of environmental things, such as like fisheries and like agricultural industries. And I feel like they're always going to be intertwined, because I know with fishing and things, like, there are quotas, and once all the fishermen hit that quota, you're not allowed to fish anymore because you're going to allow the populations to recover. But I feel like with regulations, like, I understand that there is like ecological degradation with what humans do. I feel like there always will be, unless we like quite literally reset the system in which we live in.
So what would that reset look like?
I mean, if I had the answer, I'd be sure to share it with everyone who would listen. But I don't know. I feel like we as in like, I guess you could say Americans. And of course your opinion's gonna be different, but I feel as though we live in an unfair society that we didn't necessarily ask for. Like, we didn't make these decisions ourselves, and we're having to pay the consequences of them. So I don't necessarily think there is an answer to it. Like, as Bijou said, like, this is a wicked problem and there might be several answers to them, but they're all going to have consequences that not necessarily will affect us individually, but it will affect somebody somewhere. And I believe, like, yes, a regulation is not going to benefit everybody, but if it benefits somebody, then it would be worth looking into.
All right. So let's focus on the second half of that question, which is, clearly, where these environmental issues are causing economic flux. Let's focus on to what extent that's a bad thing, and let's direct it in a particular way, which is when we were talking about the goods and bads of pollution the other week. One idea that kept coming up from all of you was that pollution can lead to innovation. We can invent cleaning technologies, we can invent scrubbers, we can invent more efficient modes of production. Do we not see the same thing in an industry like shrimping? And is such forms of innovation, is that good?
I think
Are
the
such forms of innovation?
thing I was about to like ask was, we talked about, and I wanted to bring it back to like Annika's original discussion post, and when she talks about, can we really have economic endeavors without ecological or environmental destruction? And it just goes back to the whole point of like, that is economics, is that there is the balance and imbalance, and that in itself we are dealing with scarcity, and so we automatically have these issues because there is a set amount of these resources, and it's a matter of how do we go about allocating them responsively. And I think of like how we originally said, I always forget his name, but he talked about how economics is a dismal science, and that eventually we'll get to a point where we would all kind of not exist anymore because we would like utilize all the resources and have nothing. And what countered his argument was technology. And I was going to say, like, the one thing we haven't factored is there technology, or could we develop a system of technology that would counter ecological destruction? Or is it that it's too great of an issue for technology to single-handedly solve?
Right, excellent question. And so for the record, you're talking about Malthus, and the Malthusian argument is that, well, eat and fuck ourselves into oblivion. But to that point, we have not starved yet, and he made that argument hundreds of years ago because we can grow a lot more food with much less land now. In answer to your question, is there a form of technology, and all technology is knowledge. So is there a form of knowledge that prevents environmental degradation? Certainly, right? It just depends on the scope of what we're looking at. Already we have technologies that result in clean fuel, or perhaps, to be less extreme, less pollution-based fuel, right? Already we have technologies for how we can clean various environments, whether they be land or sea or air. Hopefully, this technology progresses. Certainly, there is, in microcosm, environmental growth without additional pollution. Arguably, right now, all of you are expanding your minds and not polluting any more than you would be in the outside option, which is sitting in your dorm rooms watching Netflix.
But how would we allocate these? There's Tesla, for example, and Tesla is a great alternative, or Prius, but Tesla more specifically. You can't give everyone a Tesla, or can expect everyone to be able to purchase one. And so I think the greater question is, a lot of these technologies do exist. They just can't be developed sometimes to the extent that we need them to be as a result of like economic barriers, like solar panels. How many people have solar panels on their house, or can be able to like afford to do that? And I think maybe that's the economic issue. Is not even that we don't have solutions, but we don't know how to ensure that they're universal.
Well, I would argue that the economic issue is not one of universality, right? We're concerned with direction. So can we make the world a better place, most broadly? Not can we make the world a utopia, but can we make it better? And then with a specific eye to the environment, what is a mechanism for allocating perhaps more solar power? And perhaps eventually we reach a point of universal solar power. But when you use a term like degradation, what you want to do is first slow the growth of degradation and then perhaps create environmental progress. Anyone want to chime in? Any agreements, disagreements?
I feel like even though we have those like new technologies for environmental, like more sustainable things, there's still the problem of, oh, we've created this, but then something not always, but ends up going wrong, or, oh, this isn't actually as good as we thought it was, it's actually worse. that can tie that. So it could go either way. I don't know, I feel like if we're gonna create new technology that we claim to be more sustainable, there needs to be more time behind it. It's like the trend with metal straws. It became a thing, oh, save the turtles metal straws, which is great, it is. But then it got to the point where we're making so many metal straws that people are only going to use them for a certain time period, and then they're just going to end up in the landfills anyway because that trend is going to be over. So it always goes back and forth with, oh, is this actually more environmentally friendly? It's not something you just do for a couple months. It has to be something over time that can continue to improve off of, not fail, and then we have to create something completely new.
Excellent point. And to use the Tesla example, you're not really saving carbon. We'll discuss this paper more later in the semester if you're plugging your Tesla into an electrical outlet, which is then burning coal. And in some parts of the country where the coal is more sulfuric, you could be creating new externalities. So it's not just carbon release, but it's also SOx release. So let's try and bring this full circle in the last 10 minutes or so of class. How do we link this concept of progress and perhaps progress more broadly defined with our specific concern from the beginning of environmental racism? And is there something we can do to make sure that when we see an impact, whether it be a negative impact like pollution or a positive impact like progress, that impact is also fairly distributed? What do you all think? Or, do you want to lead the discussion somewhere else as we wrap up our unit on pollution?
I think if governments were to help companies become more sustainable, more environmentally friendly, then those companies, the items that they make will also be more sustainably made. And then getting to the fact that if that's more sustainably made, it's all across the board, then for anybody, whether you're above or below the poverty line, you're going to be able to afford or use that item.
Yeah, and I think that what you said is particularly key, this concept of help, right? Because throughout today's discussion and really over the last 3 weeks, we've talked about a bunch of different approaches, whether it's businesses abating their pollution, or consumers being more green in their choices, or any number of things. But it's not always clear what the next approach is. So I think if there's more done to help us, whether as consumers or as producers or citizens more generally, I think that's a good starting point. What about the rest of you? What do you all think?
I kind of agree with, I think Grace said it. I could be wrong. I'm sorry if I am, but we need a hard reset in general. I feel like in order to change, having more low income areas and places deal with that environmental effect, we need a hard reset of what we value. And because I feel like our society, while yes, we're advancing with technology and all that, there's still a lot that is still going based off of farming times in the olden times. We're not fully caught up, I would say, knowledge wise as a whole. I don't know if that makes sense.
Well, what do you mean based off farming times or olden times?
I feel like, yes, we have technology, and yes, we're starting to integrate that into our lives, but I feel like, such as education, I feel like things are still in some ways not archaic, but still going off of our past knowledge and not really moving along with our updated technology. I don't know if that makes sense, but what I'm trying to say.
Well, certainly you're saying a lot, right? This is the problem with talking about things in terms of a hard reset. It's difficult to find, say, a starting point.
Yes.
So with that, if you don't mind, let's open it back up to the floor. What do the rest of you think?
Couldn't you say technology is what got us in this mess, though?
Would I, or would Christina, or would anyone else?
And just a random, I don't know, just a thought.
So
I thought we said was like, not only just, sometimes we think of technology as we industrialized, and therefore as a result, a lot of these negative, and a lot of the negative externalities were like ecological or environmental, but technology in the sense of if it's in economics is also knowledge. And I think that it's improved many aspects of life, including our mortality rates, for example. So I don't think it's gotten us into this mess. I think that we did not know we would get to this point, and as a result, we were not able to think about different aspects of technology that could have better supported the environmental components of our everyday life.
I think that's particularly well said. Anyone else have anything they want to add? So I wouldn't say technology got us into this mess. And I wouldn't necessarily say anything about what got us into this mess, right? So if, and it depends on what we're talking about in terms of mess, right? We could be talking about climate change, or we could be talking about, disparate impact, or we could be talking about, ozone, or we could be talking about any number of, levels of pollutants. But I'm fairly certain that conditional on being in the state we're in, technology will be the only thing that gets us out of it. And we talked about this a little bit in our homework with, what are some of the ways that we can adapt, and how might those forms of adaptation help us? And so, like, I think the example I gave, rather timely, was wildfires. And certainly one of the ways we can adapt is move away from the forest. But I find explanations like that, and full disclosure, this is an explanation I gave on your answer key. I find explanations like that very frustrating, right? So to bring it back to your point, did technology, or more specifically industrialization, or I would say people caused climate change, and for the sake of completeness, that is the view that we take in this class. Certainly, you all are allowed to disagree, but that disagreement needs to be based in both, civics and science. But what I find sort of unhelpful about those arguments is I would not like to be in a situation where I didn't have this computer to talk to all of you, or this phone which I carry around in my pocket, or those lights above me, or this air conditioning system set to 70 degrees. I'm not willing to give any of those things up and live some Luddite lifestyle. So conditional on all that, how can we mitigate the effects of climate change? And, relevant to this class specifically, how can we incentivize people to mitigate those effects? So that we've got about 4 minutes left. Any closing thoughts? All right. Well, don't forget to write your essay questions. Remember, you only have to use one of the prompts. There are 2 prompts up there. You can pick whichever one you like best. All the instructions are on Canvas. Remember to make student hours appointments if you want additional help. I believe the next problem set is also posted. Let me double check that. Yeah, so I've posted problem set 2. That'll be due the 28th before class. Don't forget to read the new syllabus. The changes are minimal. They'll really just help the flow of the schedule and everything moving forward. Any questions? Anything you guys want to know?
Is there a rubric for our presentations?
The presentations in 201 or the presentations in this class?
Oh, maybe I'm getting confused. Never mind.
Either way, yes, although the presentations in this class aren't for like 2 months. So don't worry about that. But I'll post everything to Canvas. Thank you for asking. Any other questions, comments, concerns? All right, well, thank you, everyone. Great job. Keep using the discussion board on Canvas. The more you use it, the more robust these Zoom discussions can get. And with that, have a great weekend, everyone. Stay safe, stay distanced, and I'm here if you need anything.